Welcome to the Canadian Herpetological Society December Virtual Conference. My name is Pamela Rutherford and I am Chair of the Meetings and Workshop Committee. Our keynote speaker today will be introduced by Amanda Bennett, who is Secretary of CHS.
Keynote speaker today is Dr. Fred Schueler, who was also our Michael Rankin Distinguished Herpetologist Award winner this year, who will be presenting on Dr. Cook's legacy and his friendship with Francis. So without further ado, Fred, please go ahead.
Now, we just made this presentation, finished it about 15 minutes ago, so we haven't gone through it, so we're going to try to get through it within the 30 minutes we're allocated. Francis was my herpetological mentor. I started out as a birder and got sort of sidestepped onto leopard frogs as an undergraduate. And then we moved to Bishop's Mills when I had the postdoc at the National Museum of Natural Sciences so that I could get a ride into Ottawa with Francis. And we're still in Bishop's Mills. And Francis and Joyce Francis and Joyce had been at their farm 4 kilometers from here for 50 years last month. So now we're going to try to go as fast as possible. Oh, but we're not. We're not. Okay, now we can go back.
Okay. Yes, I'm going to be the narrator. Francis Russell Cook, born 3 March 1935 at Wolfville, Nova Scotia, was the third and last mixed blessing to the union of a Thomas William Cook from farmering merchant stock from Prince Edward Island, who had a PhD in psychology from Yale University, and a Dorothy Clare Cochrane of United Empire Loyalist stock, who attended Acadia Ladies Seminary. Now, yeah. These are quotes from Francis's autobiography,
which was just a couple of pages in the back of his 1984 book about herps of Canada.
After markedly uneven progress through public and private schools in Wolfville, Toronto, Saskatoon, Victoria, and Ottawa, he finally graduated from Horton Academy in Wolfville 2 years before its closing. He was an unimpressive summer camp counselor at the YMCA Camp Y in 1951, 1952, and 1953, attended Acadia University. His master's dissertation was on the herpetofauna of Prince Edward Island, and a revised version finally appeared in 1967 as National Museum of Canada Bulletin 212.
So Shelley Lozier at the Royal Ontario Museum was Francis's mentor in herpetology, and this is the classic statement of how Lozier felt about herpetology in Canada.
His first serious employment, this is about Francis again by Francis, came in the old museum laborer category in the summer of 1954 when he was field and laboratory assistant to J.S. Blakeney, then curator of herpetology at the National Museum of Canada. After a summer with the Nova Scotia Museum, he had matured sufficiently to be rehired by the National Museum as a summer assistant to Dr. Blakeney in 1956, 57, and 58. In the summer of 1959, as a technical officer, he conducted his own herpetofaunal survey in Saskatchewan for the National Museum. On 26 May 1960, he assumed the post vacated by Dr. Blakeney as curator of herpetology at the National Museum.
And Sherm had gone off to Acadia to study sea slugs.
He married Joyce Irma Crosby of Yarmouth, Nova Scotia on 26 October 1962. They own Maplestone Farm near North Augusta in Grenville County, Ontario, where Joyce raises purebred and commercial Suffolk sheep.
And Joyce has gotten out of sheep now, and she's now a coleopterist who has sort of passed herpetology on to us because she has a great backlog of beetles that she wants to get through.
He is now 1984 curator herpetology section at the National Museum of Natural Sciences, National Museums of Canada. Under his direction over 24 years, the herpetology section collections have grown from 14,000 to 133,000 specimens, with emphasis on geographic and life history variation of widespread Canadian species. It is the largest amphibian and reptile collection in Canada and the largest collection of Canadian material in the world.
And the thing that Francis was trying to do with the collections was to lay down series of collections of all the species all across the country so that people could go back and see how they changed. And he took every specimen, all those 133,000 specimens that he collected. He recorded the snout vent length and the tibia and whatever's the standard measurement for each species. And so we have all of these pre-preservation measurements of these thousands and thousands of specimens. And really the only time somebody's gone back and checked the things have changed was when Eric Hoffman came around and did this with my leopard frog specimens from my thesis. And we did the 30 years later analysis of how the DNA and genetics had changed in leopard frogs.
With the skins?
Yeah, because I preserved them as skins because it was easier to measure, but it turns out I'd also preserved the DNA.
Dr. Cook spent 2
No,
years,
you're not going to get rid of that.
not going to get rid of that, in educational leave from the museum, 1968 to 1970, working with Dr. Kenneth W. Stewart in Manitoba. His thesis dissertation, an analysis of toads of the Bufo americanus group in a contact zone in Central North America, was accepted by the University of Manitoba in 1978 for a PhD degree and published by the National Museum of Natural Sciences as Publications in Natural Sciences #3.
Yeah, and this was hybridization between Bufo americanus, or well, however you pronounce the new name, and Hemiophories east of Winnipeg. But he also looked at just thousands. He spent thousands of hours measuring fluid preserved toads and found influences of Hemiophories extending all the way to James Bay.
So Michael Oldham note, Francis Cook inspired and assisted in a generation of Canadian herpetologists, including Michael J. Oldham. Mike first contacted Francis in 1972 as a grade 11 high school student asking for copies of a couple of Francis's publications. Francis responded with the requested publications and a letter asking to hear of Mike's interest in herpetology, and especially of field observations from your area, as I have had few contacts in the Peterborough area. That exchange began a more than 45-year correspondence involving hundreds of letters and emails exchanged.
And this mentoring is something that was standard for the curators at the National Museum back in the day. And they spent an awful lot of time writing letters and with mammals and birds and herps and fish. There's always people in the older generations who had this letter writing contact with the National Museum.
He has done field work in every province of Canada except Newfoundland. He has also never set foot in the Yukon or the Northwest Territories. He regards himself primarily as a herpetogeographer because he has yet to find an amphibian or reptile new to science, and his publications show an obsession with herpetofaunal distribution. He has actually finished and had published, 1984, 87 papers, notes, book reviews, lists, abstracts, and miscellaneous popular articles, mostly about amphibians and reptiles, and has half again as many unfinished manuscripts or definite plans for unfinished manuscripts.
And he continued to have definite plans for finishing vast amounts of stuff. Oh,
right up until it was obvious he wasn't going to.
Yeah. And so he was a member of a great number of societies and organizations, and he was on the steering committee of the Ontario Amphibian and Reptile Atlas, which the Ontario Reptile Amphibian Atlas descended from the Eastern Ontario Herp Atlas and was started without telling Eastern Ontario herpetologists that it was going to start. And so we got a steering committee together, but Francis was always very skeptical about Atlas data. And so we'll go on to the next slide. Oh, so this is from 2001 at the, was it Karknet or DAPCAN? whatever we were called in 2001, where we were going back to some of the places where Sherm Blakeney, who's third from the left, and Francis had collected for Francis's initial survey of Prince Edward Island. So we were going back 40 years later, and a significant portion of all Canadian herp specimens were collected by the individuals in that photograph. And so there was this, back in the day, I mean, everything has changed so much with iNaturalist and atlases and everything, but there was this rule that there were no site records in herpetology, that you couldn't document the extent of a species range unless you had a specimen. And so Francis, as it said in the caption here, didn't hew to that religiously, but it was sort of in the background.
It was sort of embedded in his culture.
And he was skittish about a lot of atlasing data. And so through the 70s and the 80s, we had a really good relationship with the what's now the Canadian Museum of Nature. And in 89? Anyway, Francis said that if you live on the edge, you're bound to be on the wrong side of it sometimes. And there were administrative changes at the museum. And in 1990, Aleta and David Tomes and I did a survey of herpetology Outer Bruce Peninsula, which we'd agreed with Parks Canada that we were going to do. And the museum had taken on a commercialist point of view about they were only going to release their data if they were paid, and they were going to charge for things.
And they charged for us.
Partly because their budget was being cut by the government, and we had this arrangement, and we went through with it, but the museum administration said that they weren't going to, because they weren't getting a cut of the contract, they weren't going to do anything to encourage it. And Francis and Mike Rankin went ahead and did some of the things they were told not to do to help us. And then go on.
Yeah. So this is
now all this time, Francis, from the time they moved to Maplestone in 1970, Francis was catching and measuring frogs in choruses, and the toads that he encountered walking down the lane with the dog. And the first winter we were here, he'd measured 1,000 leopard frogs from around their house and
released them.
And yeah, marked them, toe clipped them, and all this stuff. And he did it without any, this wasn't part of his job at the museum, and it wasn't acknowledged or supported by the museum. But this Pitfalls in Quantifying Amphibian Populations was the only article that he ever published about those data. And so we've inherited this sort of 45 years of data about
peepers, versicolor,
for peepers and
everything,
chorus frogs and turtles, and so the museum went in a kind of as I say, the best museum, self-destructive, the best museum of reorganization in the world, and a new director came in who proclaimed himself president. This is while they were becoming an independent crown corporation rather than part of the government. And they told everybody that they had to decide whether all the employees, whether they were going to be part of collections or research. And Francis said, well, I've spent my life building up the collections, so I'll stay on collections. So he was a senior collection specialist. And then they decided that everybody who had a PhD had to be a research scientist. And so then for a year and a bit, he was a research scientist. And then they said, well, everybody who's worked with what the public would consider an animal as a curator has to be fired. And so, so the curators of groups that would be considered animals were, by the public, were fired.
It was their reason for Francis was that he hadn't published enough papers, but then he had been doing what they told him to do, which was work on his book. And then they said, well, we're not going to publish the book. And so there you go.
There you go.
There you go.
And then he stuck with it and became emeritus researcher.
Went in every day just the same.
Just because he did loyalty. And so at the meeting of the general meeting of the staff where the curators were fired, his plan was to have a recording of the Mary Ellen Carter up in the balcony and play it, but that didn't happen. And so one of the things that we do every fall, or I mean every winter solstice, is we gather up all of our waste material and set fire to it on the solstice, just as a way of converting waste into light. And one of the interesting things was Francis would never come. He'd come to the party and he'd sit around and talk with people and talk, and then eat the pudding with special sauce on it at the end. But he would never come out to the fire. And the reason he wouldn't come out to the fire
was then why the departure from ancient tradition. The winter solstice was never marked by big outdoor fires. These were the characteristic celebration of the summer solstice, with an outdoor fire at all. But he was afraid we might burn the village down and it would be his fault because Fred was his associate.
Yeah,
he was Fred's mentor. He took this seriously. So he wouldn't attend any conflagrations.
And then, you know, some of us sort of moved into herpetology because there was no permitting involved. I mean, those of us who went from ornithology to herpetology, it was nice that you didn't need a permit to collect herps. And
but that didn't stay. So here he was.
So the thing is that as you do work to discover that things are rare, then and draw attention to them, then they increasingly require permits. And Francis was very diligent about applying for permits, but insisting on the old sort of museum freedom to go where you needed to go and catch what you needed to catch.
So there's a lot of tug and pull and push. And this is worth reading, but I'll try and read it quickly. Many thanks for B permit, but it applies only to SARA designated species and states that I have to file a report by 31 January 2013. The permit bears an issuing date of 22 February 2013. I assume the filing date is a typo, and the report is actually required by 31 January 2014. As well as SARA species, I had requested a general permit for all amphibians and reptiles not included in SARA. Is this to follow, or is it no longer required? I will be carrying out studies focused on Lot 3, West Half, Concession 6, Wolford, Merrickville Township, on property I own and live on throughout the year since 1970, taking observations as weather conditions dictate. In addition, I commute between my home and Ottawa irregularly, as well as occasionally to Kingston, and may examine specimens from localities en route if encountered on road or in adjacent habitat. These later activities cannot be planned in advance as they are reactive to conditions at the moment. Meeting your requirement of advance notice appears an impossibility for specific days or localities, and I hope this general notice will serve for the purpose of the permit. Regards, Francis Cook.
And one of the things is that all these permits are issued by people who know so much less about the species that the permits are requested for than the people who are applying for the permit. But I suppose everybody's familiar with that phenomenon.
And it goes on and gets worse.
And then Fenya Brodo keeps applying people for awards and prizes and stuff. And she started a thing to have Francis awarded the Order of Canada.
And it succeeded.
And
he was surprised.
There he is being astonished. And then Francis has been failing health for a decade at least.
I think in the same year as he was awarded, he died.
Yeah. And so there's the link to the obituary in the local paper. And so now we move on to Joyce's processing. Francis saved immense amount of stuff, and Joyce would give him stuff to take to recycling at the dump, and then she would find it in the loft of the barn where he deposited it. And so this is a picture of the bins of documents.
They're now downstairs in the archives in Kempville.
And we'll now sort of skip through this. You can just imagine the volume. There's field notes with measurements of specimens, and a binder that has photocopies of
all
herp
the catalogs. Yeah.
And this is binders that are chapters of his Amphibian and Reptiles of Canada book, which
he always intended to finish.
He started in 1960, and people, Arthur Clarke wrote, he's the one that actually finished it, the Mollusks of Canada, but it was only published after he left the museum. And Don McAllister started the Fish of Arctic Canada, and that was only finished after he died and his successor had retired. So now to move on to what to do about these long-term studies. And as some of you know, Aleta and I have got long-term studies around here that are sort of interestingly almost adjacent to where Francis had his auditory monitoring transects. And this is the map Dave Seaburn made for us of all the places where we have records in our database from Canada. And the red dots are, you can go back. The red dots are herp records, which came up to the top of the pile because of the way I sorted them. But you can see that there's a number of them all across the country. And it's herpetology, we really need long-term studies because we both have this contrast between long-lived species like turtles and mud puppies and ambystoma, the bigger ambystoma that just come out for a month and lay their eggs and then go back and live in a hole for the 11 months of the year. And then we have these species with huge year-to-year fluctuations in abundance and growth, which are mostly toads. I mean, mostly are anurans that, you know, they lay the eggs and the tadpoles either survive or don't survive. And once you get into long-term monitoring, there's no endpoint. Because you're doing it yourself rather than because you've got a grant to do it for 4 years, or you've got a PhD to finish. There's no external pressure and there's no support to buckle down to the analysis. And then, of course, once you've gathered data for so long, it would just be an abandonment of your duty to stop gathering the data, even if you needed to do that to do the analysis.
Because the value accrues.
So we've got to have a community of encouragement for this kind of thing. And so I'm suggesting that there should be a long-term data committee of the CHS. And that would be partly to archive data sets, partly to encourage and promote the study of that kind of data. And also, and this is something that Matt Keevil has done a lot of, to find the statistical methods that are useful for extracting the conclusions from the data.
So now, I don't know how much more time we have. I suspect that we don't have much. So I'll show these next 4 slides and people can skim them really quickly.
So the barriers that exist from data collection through the data analysis and publishing are enormous for the unaffiliated scientists. And Steve Heckner says, I remember well the statement from the NSERC committee that is not clear what value long-term studies have. And
when I received news that my discovery grant support was canceled.
And so Matt Keeble suggests that we start with a workshop that presumably be at next year's meeting. We can ramp up to it with online meetings, and then see whether we would have a committee that would look into supporting and sustaining long-term data. And it's maybe not a coincidence because we're here because cooks were here, but we do have this huge body of data that we've gathered, and
all of a sudden students are popping up. We've got two of them working with our data.
Two students working on our data. And here's Claudia's mapping of the effects, year-to-year effects, where she found that it was pretty obvious. There used to be leopard frogs all over the place, and we have almost no leopard frogs now. And then these are quotes from our commonplace book of things that Francis has said in various contexts.
Then we thought we could use those in as a background for when people are asking questions, but I'm not sure how that would work.
Thank you very much, Fred and Aleta. That was excellent. I guess I can kick things off. I'm super curious about this. Trying to do more work on long-term data within CHS, figuring out how that works. Is there a model that other organizations have done that has been very successful that you would recommend?
Well, apparently the
Niall.
Canadian Evolution and Ecology Society has a long-term section, but I haven't had time to look into what they've done. The thing is that it's extracting the signal and figuring out what the signal is. And one slide we didn't put up here is long-term, auditory monitoring. We've been doing auditory monitoring here since 1992 from the house, and we don't hear so many green frogs and mink frogs as we used to, but we've got all this secondary succession going on. And so where there were just fields, now we've got forests. And from the analysis of bird songs that forests attenuate calls. And so we can't tell from listening from here whether we've got fewer, it doesn't look like we have fewer aquatic frogs when we go down to the water, but we certainly hear less calling. And there's a whole lot of complications, and so that's
that sort of thing needs to be discussed.
And we need to work on what the statistical methods are. And quite frankly, I dropped out of statistical methods after I finished my thesis in 1979. And so everything everybody does is using things sort of more subtle than multiple regression and canonical correlations and trend surfaces.
Kind of following up along that, Dave Seaburn has a question in the chat. Has any of Cook's data been digitized, or is all in the notebooks? I have tried reading letters written by Francis, and his handwriting is challenging, to say the least. Do you know if anything's been digitized?
Well, his son Tom digitized a bunch of stuff, but I haven't seen a copy of that. But it certainly wasn't a very large fraction of it.
If we could get some funding for Tom, I'm sure he'd be happy to dive right into it.
Yeah, Francis's writing of data isn't as unintelligible as some of his just writing of text. But we've got these 33 tubs that we haven't, or 30 tubs of documents that we haven't gone through. I haven't really seen, it's nothing like Darwin. I haven't seen anything Francis wrote that was really illegible.
And the other thing is the book, the Amphibians and Reptiles of Canada. We need a committee to really strike out into the finishing of that, the revisiting Francis's species accounts, updating them, writing the ones that he, and people who are specialists in these species, writing the species accounts to make a kind of a multi-authored book out of it, because it deserves to be, one of the reasons why it deserves to be published is it's got my watercolors in of every amphibian and reptile in Canada from life, except for a few of the ones like sea turtles that I did from death. So the museum holds all these, and this is a huge project, and we have to go ahead with it. And if CHS would help support it and discuss it, and maybe form a committee, that would be awesome.